Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Brigadier General Ari Singer. General, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
I have to apologize to you because I feel like I've been harassing you for a long time now to come back on the briefing. And I know that you're not just dodging me, you're in the Army. So
Right.
you're doing much more important things, but it's great to see you in civilian clothing today and joining us.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with an important question. You know, your role in the Army is very much connected to the readiness of the IDF and overseeing the reserve soldiers. So why don't we start with this big question about how ready are we for a war in Lebanon? What is the current status of the manpower of the IDF?
Okay, I think first we're implementing plans. I mean, we made the needed adjustments for many years. We knew this day would come, and we're prepared. I think there's less resources than we would want, but again, in war, you never have enough resources. Whenever you can always use more. But on the other hand, the troops are battle hardened. I mean, everybody's going to fight in Lebanon have experience already in the front of in the northern front, and they have experience in Gaza. So I think they're ready. If there will be more resources, and I think one of the things that's going to have to happen after the war is finished is we're going to need a bigger IDF. If we thought we can downsize the IDF, we're going to have to go in the opposite direction and have more units, especially in the ground forces. As a result, if we'd have a bigger army with the stratagem, I imagine would be different. I mean, there would be better ways to trick or outwit the enemy. But once we'll get the mission, we're ready, and I think there are many. We're ready much better than if we'd have to start out fighting on the northern front.
Got it. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's talk about this war in Lebanon and what the goals of the war are. For people who have been watching these briefings all week, I've had different guest experts who have shared a slightly different nuanced understanding of what the war goals are, to the effect that are they more Hezbollah focused or more Israel society focused? So I'm curious for you to share your understanding of why we are going to war right now with Hezbollah.
Okay, we're going to war. We're going to the war with Hezbollah because we're in an impossible situation. That's something on the table which has to be dealt with. Both answers are right. And when you're talking about goals, you usually talk about short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. The main goal is that October 7th can happen again. In other words, we can't be surprised. We can't be deterred by the Hezbollah, which means that there are two main goals that we have to accomplish. First, no Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. And when we talk about no Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, it's also the infrastructure and also the Radwan forces. In other words, just moving the Radwan forces beyond the Litani, which is taking them more or less out of the line of sight to the Israeli city towns and cities on the north is not enough because they have infrastructure that also has to be dealt with. In other words, we have to not only capture or make sure there's no enemy in the area, but there's a lot of mopping up that has to be done. And that's the first and main goal. The second goal is to make sure, and that's more of a long-term goal, is that we have to make sure that the Hezbollah won't grow into a beast like it was before. We have to add into our toolbox a preemptive strike. That's something which we didn't do for many years. And as a result of the negligence, if you don't deal it when it's small, then you have to deal with the problem when they become a beast. So in other words, implementing the UN Resolution 1701 isn't enough. And that's more or less the two main goals. As a result, if we'll be able to accomplish the first goal, then I'm sure we'll be able to resettle the civilians that were uprooted from their home back into their towns, which is also part of the goal of the Israeli society, of what you call the goals in the rest of the Israeli society. But again, when we talk about security, there are two different terms, which both of them can be quantitative. One is security. That's quantitative. In other words, you check how many incidents there are on the border and see if it grows or decreases. There's also a sense of security, which is as important. That's also something that you can that's empiric. In other words, you can make polls and ask, do you feel secure or not? It's not as important as security, but it's also very, very important. If you want these towns to flourish, they have to have a sense of security. And we have to solve the problem. We have to solve the problem once and for all, and not evade the problem and hope for the best.
Now, when we were speaking earlier today, I asked you about how the missile, I should say, that was fired to Tel Aviv this week should impact the IDF's response. And you said something very fascinating. I don't know if you remember it, but can you share that with us?
I hope I remember. When we talk about an enemy, we shouldn't only talk about its intent. We should talk about its capabilities. And many times we judge our enemy by what we understand his intentions, but we really can't ever really know what the intentions of the enemy is. When we're talking about deterrence, that has an expiration date. We don't know how long he's deterred. It can be a day, it can be a year, it can be 15 years. One of the very, very big mistakes that we did over the years is after the Second Lebanese War, we talked about that the enemy is deterred. That's what we thought, but actually, he was building up his capabilities. So, in other words, we can't. Am I surprised that they shot a missile at Tel Aviv? The answer is no. Everybody knew that they're capable of firing missiles to Tel Aviv. So, its intentions of whether they'll fire, whether they won't fire, whether there'll be a ceasefire or there won't be a ceasefire, that doesn't interest me. What interests me is their capabilities. And since we never really understand the enemy, we have to judge them by their capabilities and make sure they don't have the capabilities to shoot missiles at Tel Aviv, whether they shoot them or not.
Okay, so in that regard, Israel has been fighting Hezbollah in one way or another since the 80s. This will not be our first war with Hezbollah, our first war in southern Lebanon. So, I mean, how is this war going to be different? If you're saying the goal is deterrence, we've never been able to accomplish.
No, the goal is capabilities, not deterrence. That's what I answered in the previous question. No, we have to make sure they don't have the capabilities. I mean, I'm from my white hair. You can see that I fought in the first Lebanese war as a young lieutenant. I fought in the second Lebanese war as a lieutenant colonel. I joke that my BA I did in the first Lebanese war and my MA in Lebanon I did on the second Lebanese war. But there's something very, very interesting. The first Lebanese war had a name. It was called Shlom Galil, Peace for Galilee. The objectives were clear, and I remember as a young lieutenant with a tank fighting, getting all the way to Beirut. In other words, Israel knew what they wanted to achieve. At the end, I think they lost their focus on the mission, and as a result, we ran away from Lebanon in the year 2000. And the security and the fact that we were in the security zone, we were just waiting to leave, and we lost our objective. And again, one of the main principles of war, it's in the British Army principles of war, is maintaining the aim. In other words, the aim changes because the enemy changes, and it's very important to maintain the aim. And we lost our focus on the aim. What's interesting is that the second Lebanese war has no name; it's nameless. In many ways, when the war is aimless, when it's nameless, it's also aimless. And we didn't really know what we wanted to achieve. In other words, we went. There was no strategy, and we went head on into Lebanon. And I'm sure that the third Lebanese war, which actually it's not the third Lebanese war, it's actually the first Northern Front war, because we can't say Lebanon yes, Syria no, and I'm sure there's one. It's you have to see it as a whole. Also, because there's not a small amount of Hezbollah in Syria, we have to have clear objectives and aim, which I answered in the previous questions. In other words, one is to make sure there's no Hezbollah in northern Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, up to the Litani. Second of all, make sure they have no infrastructure, and that's a vital issue in order that the people who left their homes go back to their homes. I think with this whole war, which is not which deserves a briefing in itself, is a wake-up call for how Israel sees its security. If I want to joke, then I can say that if the first Lebanese war was peace for Galilee, the third Lebanese war, we have to fix that the Hezbollah took actually a piece of Galilee when all people had to leave their homes. That has to change.
Okay, so let me just clarify in terms of Hezbollah capabilities. So can you just sharpen that point about their capabilities, because don't they have missiles in northern of Lebanon also? So if the goal is to take away their capacity to strike Israel and to take the Galilee, why is that limited to southern Lebanon?
When I'm talking about southern Lebanon, I'm talking about a ground operation, and the goal of the ground operation is the line of sight that they have on the border, which means that there can be when I talked in the previous question about one of the goals, that October 7th can happen again. October 7th means an invasion of Israeli sovereignty, and the border in the north is much easier to breach in many ways. There are settlements on the border, like Metula, like like Hanita and other cities, other towns. So that can happen. That can happen again. And if you have Radwan forces right on the gate, that means you have no time or no buffer zone in order to be able to defend the northern part of Israel. When we're talking about capabilities of the Hezbollah, yes, there are capabilities also in the north. And much of it is concentrated in the Bekaa Valley. Here, one of the things that's going to change, but that's after the battle, is that the Lebanese government will have to take some sort of responsibility on the terrorist army that's built that's in their country. Either they have to decide, either they take responsibility or they have to be seen as accomplices.
Okay, thank you. Let's now shift back to the army and the resolve of the soldiers. You know, they've been fighting in Gaza for 11 months, and you're saying, and now as they're transitioning up to the north, they have a lot of experience, but with that experience potentially comes battle fatigue. So what do you see in terms of the length of time we could expect troops on the ground in the north, and how does that affect the resolve of the soldiers?
Okay, I think that when you talk about an operation in Lebanon, like when you talk an operation in Gaza, then we're talking also not only about its time. It's a time on one hand, but the intensity of the war on the other hand. In other words, if you ask me what's happening now in Gaza, we're not actually in a state of war. It's a high intensity conflict, but it doesn't it's not like the textbook definition of what what is. One of the things that we have to explain to the Israeli society, we're not doing a very good job at that. In other words, everything is a war, but actually we're not allocating the proper resources to win this war decisively. But that's fine. In other words, once we know that, we make sure that the leadership in the society are on the same page. So we're looking, in my eyes, about a month or 2 months of high intensity battles, and then then between 6 and 12 months of a not a war, but some high intensity. One of the things that the Israeli army has to do is build more units. They're in the process of building another division. We need, as I said before, we need a bigger army, and the reserves have to will be much, will have to serve much more than they served before October 6th, which I think is fine. But when you're talking about resolve, it's a question of, there are two questions. Question if they understand the goals and do they have trust in the leadership. So the first question is easy to answer. They definitely understand the goals. And it's like when you invest money in something, you want a return on your investment. In many ways, the more they serve in the army, they don't want their service to be in vain. In other words, they want to have a return on the return on the investment, and that's and they don't want this to happen every few years. In other words, we have to have sustainable success of our goals, and then they'll realize that it was worth it. The second part is more difficult, to trust in leadership. I think there's a new leadership which is blooming, and it's a question of time until they'll be the leadership also of the country, also of the army. You know, in many ways, there's an anomaly with the ground soldier. You know, usually in most armies, you have the generals who are really interested in going into war, and the foot soldiers are less. But here you find, or what I find, is that it's a much higher battle spirit on the low tactical level of the companies, of the battalions, that many times I find, unfortunately, in the general headquarters. In other words, the soldier who's been taking, who's been who had to go and serve and left their job, left their family, they saw the atrocities in the South, and they know what atrocities can be done in the North, so they have resolve. And again, when I say many times, the reserve, one of the attributes of reserve soldiers is that they're very, very good jugglers. They know how to juggle between, usually there's, many people talk about work-life balance. So here, this work-life army balance, we know how to juggle, and we know how to balance.
So the IDF leadership, what formulates their opinion that it's different than the soldiers on the ground?
That's a great question. I think the army is part of the answer is in psychology. You know, you have many generals or many army officers who can go through a whole tenure in a certain job and not shoot a bullet. Because there's peace, and they go from one rank to another rank, and actually they're really, really never tested. They're tested in exercises, or but that's not real life. That's not true about a surgeon. There's no such thing as a surgeon who can be a higher ranking surgeon who never did surgery, or a lawyer who never practiced law. It's funny or sad, but many times you have army officers who would like to get promoted without having to prove that they're capable. And now during war, they have to show their capabilities. Second of all, many times leadership has it's very tiring. You're very lonely when you're a leader. You have to make the decisions. You have to face the results, the failures and the successes, and it's very, very difficult. What I find as a commander, and that I many times I got strength and power from my subordinates. In other words, they're capable. I trust them, and I'm responsible.
So do you think in 5, 10, 15 years from now, we will see a very different type of IDF leadership because it will come from the ranks who are right now on the ground fighting?
Unless they spoil when they go up, when they go up in rank. I think, yes, I think, you know, I was drafted into the regular army in 1979. 1979 was 6 years after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. My battalion commanders, my brigade commanders, are commanders that fought in the Yom Kippur War. They remembered what it looked like during Ramat Golan, what it looked like in the Sinai, how we were surprised, and they were battle ready. In other words, when the slightest, I mean, then there was less television, less, but the slightest thing that happened on the border, we shot right away. Some of the resolve of Israel in the first Lebanese war in 1982, which is 9 years after the Yom Kippur War, is that, with a whistle, we found ourselves within a week in Beirut, is because the high commanding officers then, in 1982, were served in 1973 as soldiers. In other words, they didn't look for proportionality. They didn't look for, they looked to win. And I think that when we compare the Yom Kippur War and we compare the swords of iron, this current war, I think there's much that the mistakes that were made in the beginning of this war is nowhere to compare with the Yom Kippur War. It's much, much graver, much more, and especially the way how the intelligence that we had, that we're fighting only a terror army as opposed to a regular army in two fronts simultaneously. In other words, there was no reason that what happened should have happened on October 7th. And I think what we'll learn from this will resonate for many, many years, for 5, 10, 15 years.
Brigadier General Ari Singer, I very much appreciate your time. Is there anything else I didn't ask? Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I think there's one thing which is very, very important. I mean, there's talking now about a ceasefire. And there's one thing which I'm happy about that talks about a ceasefire, because I know from history that if we're doing something right, then the world wants to stop us. So the chances are we're doing something right that we might not even know about, that the United States, and especially France and Europe and Russia and China, will say, okay, enough is enough, let's go for a ceasefire. But that would be a very grave mistake. Because in the best case scenario, at least what we don't know the details yet, it'll be a limited ceasefire, as I said before, to start a war again after it stopped for 3 weeks or a month will be very, very difficult. The goal, none of the goals of the war won't be accomplished, even if Radwan will go and try to implement the UN Resolution 1701. It's not, like it didn't work before. There's no reason why it'll work now. The UN in Lebanon, the UNIFIL, is totally incapable of making sure that the Hezbollah won't go back to where it was before. For the years they have been since 2006, they didn't report once missiles that are violating the resolution. So that would be a very big mistake, because I said before, it's not only a question of the foot soldiers, the Radwan foot soldiers that can get into a car and drive 10 minutes beyond the Litani, but it's also the missiles, it's also the tunnels, it's everything that has to be dealt with, and it's a mopping up operation that takes time. I think that's one point that I'd like to make. Second of all, we're talking about they talk about the equation, what they do and what we do. It's a tick for a tack. That has to stop. We have to stop about proportionality. When a boxer goes into the boxing arena, he doesn't want to win by points. He wants to win with a knockout. We have to knock out the enemy. And maybe I'll finish with, I'll cite one of the big Jewish generals in all of history. That was King David. From Psalms. He said, I pursued my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back until they were destroyed. I crushed them so they couldn't rise. They fell beneath my feet. In other words, we have to pursue our enemies. We have to overtake them. We can't turn back, and we have to make sure that they can't rise again. That October 7th is something which is a part of history that can happen again. If King David understood this 3,000 years ago, we have to understand that now also in 2024.
Thank you, General, for ending off with that very powerful message. I think that will certainly resonate with all of our viewers and supporters tuned in. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into this briefing, sending in your questions in the Zoom or in the emails and WhatsApps. Next week, our briefings are going to be on a little bit of a different schedule because of the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah. So I encourage everyone to please check the emails that we send out with our schedule. And then the week following also, with October 7th, special programming that we're doing. Scheduling is a little bit different. So I urge everyone, look at our emails, check the schedule. General, thank you so much for your time today. We'll be back with you, everyone, next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.